Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Free Forum, a world that just might work. I'll be speaking today with Richard KAHLENBERG about his latest book, EXCLUDED, How Snob Zoning, NIMBYism, and Class Bias Build the Walls We Don't See. And you can learn more about all of Richard's work. And this website I'm going to give you has articles going back 20 years. I mean, it's a very complete way to learn about his work and the various, quote, projects he's taken on over the years, and that is at richardkahlenberg.org. So it's all one word, Richard KAHLENBERG, and it's the word Richard, and then KAHLENBERG, richardkahlenberg.org. On Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, environment, health, economics, science, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn.com, and podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TerrenceMcNally.net. So Terrence McNally, all one word, .net. Recently, I was on a Zoom with a prominent writer who is certainly a liberal and probably what I would consider a progressive thinker about social issues and American history. And at one point, she stated that progressives hate the poor. I was struck by that. I don't agree, but it certainly got me to thinking, how is that position true and how is it not true? And a couple of days later, I heard today's guest being interviewed on an NPR program, On Point. It was actually a rebroadcast of an interview that they'd done in 2023, which in a way is fortunate for all of us that they rebroadcast, because otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation. And today's guest was being interviewed. This is Richard KAHLENBERG, and he points out not only how restrictive zoning laws, that's zoning of what you can build where, and you know, that sort of pointy-headed nerd stuff around that, negatively influences all sorts of things in this country. But also, and I think this turns out being sort of a media hook, is that such laws are more likely or more restrictive in communities that otherwise are more progressive and more liberal. I was driving at the time, and as soon as I got home, I reached out to schedule him for this conversation. According to what I can learn, his taking this position and his position against the use of race-based affirmative action, he actually served as an expert on the side of doing away with race-based affirmative action in higher education, and the Supreme Court acted on this question and has come down against such affirmative action in higher education, has brought negative reactions against KAHLENBERG from progressives and academics. And what's surprising or disappointing to me is that I don't know why it has to seem like an either-or. You either see the world through race-colored glasses or class-colored glasses. To me, both are valid and necessary. The history of systemic racism and systemic anti-immigrant bias has influenced enormously whether or not these populations can achieve income and wealth on a par with similarly able or gifted whites. And it is obvious that there is class-based discrimination in this country and always has been. And the fact that racism allows the wealthy to scapegoat people of color in order to curry favor with white, poor, working, and middle-class people doesn't change that fact. The fundamentalist free market philosophy that links the free market to a free America has cost us all. And I believe the U.S. has been for several years among the most, if not the most, unequal advanced economy in the world. To me, this notion that we must choose between dealing with race and dealing with class just seems wrong. And I believe that KAHLENBERG actually agrees. One thing I've heard him say is that given the choice between race-based affirmative action and no sort of affirmative action that attempts to get diversity into higher education, he would choose race-based affirmative action. This country has an unequal distribution of wealth, of income, of success, of housing, of education, of opportunity, etc., 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 and it is to the detriment of us all. And I look forward to speaking with Richard about all of that today. Richard KAHLENBERG is a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute and a non-resident scholar at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. He's known as, quote, and these are two quotes I got from a couple of biographies of him, is known as the intellectual father of the economic integration movement in K-12 schooling and the nation's chief proponent of class-based affirmative action in higher education. He's been a fellow at the Century Foundation and the Center for National Policy, a legislative assistant to Virginia Senator Charles Robb. He's the author, co-author, or editor of 18 books, including Why Labor Organizing Should Be a Civil Right, The Remedy, Class, Race, and Democracy, and his latest, the one we're talking about today, Excluded, How Snob Zoning, NIMBYism, and Class Bias Build the Walls We Don't See. Welcome, Richard KAHLENBERG, to Freeform, a world that just might work.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, Terrence.
I want people to know, by the way, that we are recording this Friday, March 15th. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. So can you tell us, in your words, how you see your path to the life you lead, the work you do? And this isn't just how you fell upon this latest book. This is, you can go way back, childhood inspirations, mentors, turning points, moments of decision, that sort of thing.
Well, having the opportunity to talk about oneself is a welcome one. So let me go on at tremendous length. No, I would say that my interest in issues of race and class, come from being raised in a socially conscious family. I grew up in an upper middle class family. My father was a liberal minister. My mother was and is a civic activist, and they taught me to care about larger issues in the society, not just our family's narrow self-interest. But then when I went to college, I kind of had a twist on my liberalism. I went to college in the early 1980s, so Ronald Reagan was riding high, and I couldn't understand how on earth he was so popular. But I came to realize that working class people of all races felt that they were getting a raw deal in society, and as Reagan was winning over white working class voters, I was inspired to write my thesis about Robert Kennedy and his 1968 campaign for president. And for your listeners, emphasize Robert Kennedy Sr. I'm talking about.
Yes, of course.
Yes. And he brought together Black voters, Hispanic voters, and working class white voters. In fact, some who'd voted for the segregationist George Wallace. And they came together in a coalition because he talked about their common concerns about inequality in society, about crime, about the need for better opportunity for their kids. And I just found that so inspiring. And one of Kennedy's insights was that with passage of civil rights laws, the salience of economic and racial inequality was shifting. Not that Kennedy wasn't suggesting, and I would not suggest that we've solved our racial issues, certainly, but that class inequality would become more important. And this is something that Dr. King also talked about, that there was a economic legacy of racism that remained strong, but it was primarily economic in character once we had laws in place that would seek to make sure that people are treated fairly with respect to race.
Okay, let me say a couple of things. First, I'm going to share with you. I have read in things you've talked about that that your college experience and its influence on you goes well beyond your exposure to Robert Kennedy, as you say, for whom you thought a lot about and wrote about. But also, I know that you were a legacy admission. Your father, Presbyterian minister, had gone to Harvard. And I just wanted to share a little bit about my background so we know who we're talking to here. I am 20 years older or so. I also was a legacy admission, I guess, though I'd be surprised if my family contributed a penny to Harvard. My dad went there in the GI Bill when he returned from World War II, and even the notion of charity in our family consisted mostly of collection at Sunday Mass and maybe the March of Dimes. I was the first from my public high school in Central Florida to attend Harvard, and I received significant financial aid to do so. And just for folks who are listening, an amazing thing I recalled as I was thinking about this is I recall filling out my financial aid application either between sophomore and junior or junior and senior year, and the total for room, board, and tuition at Harvard was $4,444.
Wow.
Which now seems impossible, but it was. And I suppose I can take some comfort about this legacy issue, as I've read you do, from also being accepted at other schools, including Yale and Princeton. So it wasn't all down to where our fathers went to school. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, I'd like your take on something I've long felt. When most people talk about the rightward drift of this country since the 70s, they start with Ronald Reagan and they go on from there. And I believe political assassination played a much larger role than is usually cited. I believe the American people and American voters favor charismatic optimists as leaders, and they're hard to come by. And the assassinations of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X, and I believe you could throw in John Lennon as sort of an enormously influential influencer of the time. I believe those deaths had a much greater deal to do with the pivot in this country than they are usually credited with. And by the way, looking at the current situation in Gaza, I would add the assassinations of Begin and Sadat as well. Your thoughts about both of those, sort of the Harvard experience, but also the role of assassination in changing what this country even thought it was about?
Well, that's a really interesting point. So to start with my experience at Harvard, I
you wrote a book about it, right?
I wrote a book about my law school experience at Harvard, and but I think that if I'm trying to psychoanalyze why I've been obsessed with issues of class inequality, I think it probably has to do with some level of guilt that my grandfather was a successful lawyer in Chicago and put me through Harvard, put my kids through college. His resources. So I realize I've been very, very fortunate financially, not wealthy, but enormously wealthy, but just that I haven't had the same struggles that most Americans have had, and feel a certain burden associated with that, and needing to try to address those as I can, some of the class inequalities. So I think that is related. I will say, when I got to Harvard, I recognized that a lot of the people were as fortunate or more fortunate economically than I was, and that included the Black and Hispanic students. Many of them came from quite advantaged backgrounds. So that was part of my experience, that Harvard had created kind of this multiracial aristocracy, where that you would have generations of people, explicitly through the legacy policy, but also just kind of the same types of people from the same types of financial background going year in and year out, and that there was something wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
On your point about assassinations, I think that's really, really interesting. I haven't thought deeply about it. I will say that those were obviously the two Kennedys who were assassinated, and Martin Luther King. I mean, those are transformative for the country, and I do think we make progress when we have charismatic figures, whether it's Franklin Roosevelt or the progress John Kennedy was beginning to make during his administration. I would put Barack Obama's progress associated with that charisma and Ronald Reagan's success.
Yeah, exactly.
As well.
Exactly.
So I think there's a through line there that I think you're very perceptive on that.
Yeah, and with Obama, I assume you, as I, were frustrated by his unwillingness to take on Wall Street as much as I think he should have and could have following the crash. When we look at Roosevelt in the Depression, he said, they hate me. They're going to hate me for what we're going to do. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but make me do it, and so on. Mm-hmm. And Obama, who had a phenomenally, I think Obama's charismatic optimism was what allowed a black to be elected president. I wish, that he'd used it in a more Rooseveltian way to take advantage of the crisis that he faced.
Yes, I agree with that. And on the issue of affirmative action per se, there was also a chance for a breakthrough, in my view. I mean, he said, and when asked during the campaign, do your daughters, were quite educationally and economically privileged, do they deserve a preference? And he said, of course not. And working class people of all races do. And I was quite excited by that because I've been advocating affirmative action based on economic disadvantage for all races, and talked to an Obama official who was pretty high up in the administration. Can I help President Obama in making that transformation? And she checked into it and came back and said, well, no, the interest groups will never allow us to do that.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's he always had an interest in economic inequality and bringing together people of different races. And one of his heroes in law school was Bayard Rustin, who did those things. But he wasn't able to take on the interest groups within his party, who were very much just focused on helping upper middle class people of color as opposed to working class people. And in fact, this official said to me, the courts have to force him to do it. And that is what got me involved in litigation against Harvard and the University of North Carolina, that it was really going to take the courts to transform affirmative action into something that was more inclusive of working class people of all races.
Well, I've actually found myself over the last year and a half, maybe even longer, turning to historians more often than I used to, as to sort of the question of how did we get here. I'm guessing with your focus in your work, even though you are not a historian, you must have grappled over the years with what is the history, or how do you assess that shift happened? By that I mean that shift from the Democratic Party being a party that understood the needs of the working class, of the middle class, of the less affluent, as well as the racial divisions in the country, how it ended up tilting so much in one direction, and to my mind, I mean, going even back to specifically to Obama, had he, I think, taken on Wall Street in healing the nation from the crash, I think Trump would still be going down that escalator and not in our lives every day for 8 years. How do you see that happened? That the overemphasis on race and seeming to be, as I said in my intro, a false choice between race and poverty.
Right. Well, on that latter point, let me say I agree. Racism and racial inequality present distinct challenges and distinct harms in our society, as opposed, apart from class. So I agree with you. They both represent challenges, and I'm a big proponent of making sure we spend more resources on enforcing our civil rights laws to address racial inequality. The Fair Housing Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. These are all important laws that deal with a distinct challenge having to do with racism. But over time, Democrats ended up focusing much more on race than class. And I think a couple things are going on. I mean, one is the decline in the American labor movement. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the most important changes in American society. And when David Broder of the Washington Post was retiring a number of years ago, he was asked, what's the biggest change in Washington? And he said, the decline in labor. When he started in the 1950s and early 1960s, labor was the most important political force in the country, and certainly with the Democratic Party. And over time, labor has atrophied, and in its place, you see, obviously we've got the growing demographic change in the country, and so people of color have been asserting their voices in powerful ways, which is totally appropriate and a good thing for society. But there's the people who represent the interests of people of color tend to emphasize upper middle class people of color. If the civil rights groups, our member organization, who's active in those memberships? It's upper middle class people who have the time to really be involved. And one legislator or official in California told me that the Hispanic caucus cares a lot more about getting 15 more slots at UC Berkeley than making sure that community colleges, where the vast majority of working class Hispanics go, are adequately funded. And so there's an elitism within liberalism that has taken root, and working class people notice it. Working class whites have long been headed in the Republican direction, and now working class Hispanic and Black people are also beginning to trend away from Democrats as Democrats instead become the party of white, upper middle class, highly educated, kind of culturally liberal individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I assume you're aware of George Packer's book, The Last Best Hope. But in any case, where he lays out four...
Fabulous book.
Yes, where he lays out four narratives. And what we're describing as to what's happened to so much of the Democratic Party is the one that he calls smart America, and associates sort of most absolutely with the Clintons. the cosmopolitanism, which then leads you to think of yourself as a global citizen, things like this that seem to separate the Democrats from the people. And here I'm going to say something that has also been on my mind for a long time, and that is that the Democrats were the party whose principles would favor the middle class, the working class, the poor. The Republicans much less so. But what happened, and I pitch it really at the Clinton moment as when it all tipped over, was that as the Democrats began to, as campaigns became more expensive, when TV advertising became the method of campaigning and campaigns became much more expensive, the Democrats began to turn to enlightened, if you will, I put air quotes around that, folks among the wealthy and Wall Street and so on. And and this is going on, as you point out, at the same time that the unions are being decimated by, I would say, aggressively by the Republicans. But what you end up with is the Democrats and the Republicans getting their money from the same sources, the Republicans being aligned with their sources, and the Democrats being somehow ambivalent with principles that say we're here for the working class and the middle class of all colors, but funding that represents the wealthy. And I think that it if nothing else, it really eroded their backbone.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And I would put the blame more with Hillary Clinton than Bill Clinton. I think Bill Clinton, at least initially, was concerned about bringing together working class people of all races and had some success with it. But when Hillary Clinton in 2016 made her famous comment about half of Trump's supporters being deplorables, she did it several times, and it was before several fundraising groups. So it would, at Martha's Vineyard and elsewhere, the Hamptons, she would talk to very, very wealthy Democrats, and use that terrible term that denigrated millions and millions of our fellow Americans as deplorables, a noun, and that's important because
that's right.
Certainly, some of the things that some Trump supporters say are deplorable. The homophobia, the racism, all of that is to be denounced. But it's one thing to say someone is acting deplorably, another to define them by their worst instincts. They are deplorables. And there's a journalist who writes for the American Prospect who said, to your earlier point, Terence, that Hillary never used the term deplorables to describe the people who had tanked the economy on Wall Street. That is not. She left it for people who, primarily had lower levels of education than her. That's who she was looking down upon, and people understand what's going on. They feel the condescension, and that help drive away working class people from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I read a quote from you which said, when I hear someone like Donald Trump say the system is rigged, part of me finds that appealing. And my response to that, Rick, was let's not forget that Bernie Sanders began almost every speech in 2016, at least everyone that I was aware of, with exactly that assertion.
Yes.
And that I believe that 2016, and I mean, this is not radical except for what I say should have happened. I believe 2016 was a change election, an outsider election, and that your vision for America, which also is very much mine, would have benefited enormously had Hillary Clinton stepped aside in the face of the kinds of passionate crowds of 25,000 that were showing up not just for Donald Trump, but for Bernie Sanders. And I believe Sanders would have been immune from most of Trump's accusations against Hillary and would have won in 2016, and that this country would be a very different place today.
Yes. Well, it's fascinating that you could have some voters who were interested in either Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders.
Right.
And it has a parallel in the Robert Kennedy campaign where Robert Kennedy Sr., where there were people who said their vote was coming down to George Wallace or Robert Kennedy. Now, on civil rights, they were at opposite poles. Kennedy was a huge champion of civil rights and of the interests of Black people, and is celebrated for that very reason. But the fact that there are people who are, as Bayard Rustin used to say, neither liberal nor conservative, they're both. And how we define issues will determine whether they vote Democratic or Republican. And that's what drove me nuts about the old system of racial preferences, was that it defined the most economically advantaged Black person as more deserving of assistance than the least advantaged white or Asian student. And that people understood that made no sense. I mean, 2/3 of Americans have opposed the use of race in college admissions. 2/3 favor a preference for economically disadvantaged people.
Yeah. And I assume that description you were just making there reminded me of Arlie Hochschild's work in A Stranger in Their Own Land, which I'm sure you're resonant with, in which she says that the story, and we're talking here, we've in what we've been saying, we've been talking about the power of emotion, and that when you even said, they know what's going on, you're not fooling them. That's emotion and story, and that policy, which is what your books are about, is important, but maybe not when a culture is defining itself or people are in the voting booth. But just for listeners, Arlie Hochschild spent 5 years in Louisiana, in sort of the cancer belt of lower Louisiana, and came out with that the story that those people were telling themselves that drove them was that they were in line for the American dream and they weren't getting ahead. And that's one thing, but the feeling they got was that other people were breaking in line ahead of them, and that they were being assisted by Democratic leaders. I think that's a pretty good statement of what she was saying, and you can see how that story makes sense, and you can see what would flow from it.
Yes. Well, the phrase she used was, or the people she interviewed used time and time again, was other people are cutting in line.
Yep.
And there have been these polls that find that working class white people think that discrimination against white people is greater than discrimination against Black people. And most people, myself included, kind of look at that and say, well, how on earth can they possibly think that? Because, we see evidence all around us. Black people trying to hail taxi cabs, mistreatment by the police. Clearly, that I think any sentient being would recognize that on one level, racism continues to be a big problem, and that Black people are the primary victims. And yet, the fact that places like Harvard explicitly say we're going to prefer Black applicants over white applicants, no matter what their economic status, rankles. And I think that's the way to interpret those findings, that some white people think they're being discriminated against.
Right. It's not necessarily a description of what they face what they face as they try to move forward, but I think it's a feeling arisen from a perception of who cares.
Right.
And
right.
What's being done to help them. Okay, we're at about the halfway point. Let me tell people the book is Excluded: How Snob Zoning, NIMBYism, and Class Bias Build the Walls We Don't See. My guest is Richard KAHLENBERG. His website is richardkahlenberg.org, and I'll spell it for you. It's all one word, Richard, KAHLENBERG.org. Well, we've set a great deal of the context. Let me ask you first, even though this book is not explicitly about it, but first, if you want to say anything sort of in a setting, kind of your assessment, your analysis of the college admissions affirmative action set of issues and where we stand today.
Yes, well, so for years, our elite universities, which practiced affirmative action, have been racially integrated and economically segregated. That is to say, a place like Harvard has a majority of students who are non-white, which I think is a great thing. They've diversified racially. Black, Hispanic, and Asian American students are well represented. At the same time, there are 15 times as many rich students as low-income students. So they've left the issue of economic status off the table largely. And now that the Supreme Court has struck down the use of race in admissions, I think we're likely to see many universities shift to an economic form of affirmative action because that will disproportionately benefit Black and Hispanic students so they can get racial diversity by using class-based affirmative action or economic-based affirmative action. And yet that's perfectly legal to do. So I think we're headed toward a better future for affirmative action.
Okay. And also what I'd love you to do is, and I've got some of the numbers in front of me, copied from your work, but for those who were against, we're hoping that the Supreme Court would rule otherwise and things would remain as they were, they would say that diversity will be lost if this happens. California did away, because there it came down to a vote of the people, not the elites, as you were. I put elites in quotes, but it came down to the people because it was a ballot proposition. California did away with race-based affirmative action in higher education more than 20 years ago. What has been the outcome in terms of how long did it take for that to sort of fall into a new reality that seems to work?
Yeah. Well, initially, Black and Hispanic enrollment declined quite precipitously at the University of California at Berkeley and at UCLA. Over time, they've been able to change that. And now UCLA has as many Black students as it did, when before it was banned from using race. So they built back up. It took them a while, in part, in large measure, because UCLA and UC Berkeley were trying to recruit talented Black and Hispanic students without the ability of using race in admissions, while virtually all their competitor colleges, could use race.
Right, so they were still in the right. I got it.
Yeah, and so they had one hand tied behind their back in terms of recruiting. So it's remarkable that they did as well as they did. I think actually they'll do better in the future now that everyone's on the same playing by the same set of rules. Okay,
and I think you also have some statistics of a simulation of the class of 2019 at Harvard. That found that the share of Black students would drop to 10% from 14%. White students would drop from 40% to 33%. Hispanic students would rise to 19% from 14%, and Asian American share would rise to 31%. I think the one that is already so is that in the class of 2026, the Asian proportion is about that, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes. So one of the interesting, or not interesting, troubling side effects of Harvard's focus on race is that they wanted to keep their wealthy white students as part of their class while making room for Black and Hispanic students as well. And so they put an artificial cap on the number of Asian students for many, many years. When they were sued, suddenly Asian proportions started to increase. So the lawsuit had its effect even before the Supreme Court ruled.
No, sure.
Because Harvard was under scrutiny for discriminating against Asians, and it was a bad look for them. So they started to loosen up on their cap on Asian students. But that was one of the most troubling things. As an expert witness in the case, I had an early peek at some of the documents that later became public. But Harvard had done an analysis and found there was an Asian penalty for students. If you compared like students, similar academics and other criteria, Asian students consistently were less likely to be admitted, which is really troubling. I mean, there's a whole industry of Asian applicants who, their counselors are trying to help them appear, quote unquote, less Asian. Less stereotypically Asian, which is heartbreaking.
Right, and what it also does is it means that Asians are competing with Asians rather than competing with everyone.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Once you limit that funnel. Okay, let's turn to the other issue, which is the issue that is covered in this book, and I'll mention again the title because it makes it pretty clear. It's Excluded: How Snob Zoning, NIMBYism, and Class Bias Builds the Walls We Don't See. And I believe a basic notion of your position is that housing segregation by race and class is a source of inequality in America, and yet for generations, including the present, although Biden is making strides, and we will get to that, politicians have been terrified to address the issue. And you say that you or the press materials on your book, one of them is where I got this quote: although zoning may seem like a technical, bureaucratic, and decidedly local question, in reality, the issue relates directly to three grand themes that Joe Biden ran on in 2020: racial justice, respect for working class people, and national unity, and I would add, and climate change. So I'm throwing you the ball now. What is the big problem with zoning? Because my guess is people hear about race, people hear about, unions, membership in unions falling and now rising. But I think this is something that is news to a lot of people. What's the problem? How did it get the way it is? And what can we do to fix it?
Yes, well, we have blatant class discrimination in housing, where local governments say you're perfectly welcome to come to live in our community, so long as you can afford a detached single-family home, and sometimes they'll throw in a requirement that the home sit on a plot of land that's a minimum size of half an acre or even more in some communities. Mm-hmm. And that is the effect and purpose of those laws is to exclude people of modest means, a disproportionate share of whom are Black and Hispanic. So we have economic segregation of neighborhoods that is socially engineered by government. This is not just the workings of the free market. This is government regulations making it illegal for someone to build, a duplex or a triplex, much less a small apartment building in many of these communities. And to my mind, it's blatantly unfair in that it excludes people of modest means from higher opportunity neighborhoods where the schools are stronger, the streets are safer, there are more amenities. And it also artificially drives up the price of housing for everyone. Because when you limit supply of housing in places where people want to live, you inevitably are going to drive up the price of those homes.
And let me just say to people there, if anyone, well, what do you mean limiting the supply? If you have a community or a section of a community that says it has to be single-family dwellings, that means no duplexes, no triplexes, no small apartment buildings, no large apartment buildings. And those are the ways, that if you just divide the square mileage by the number of domiciles and families, it's pretty clear that that's what's happening. And one of the things that does is, and this is, I think, a phenomenon that I don't know how aware people are of this, but that as younger, successful folks actually are now making some moves back to the city, what it's doing is there's a reversal in terms of where populations live from what happened over the course of a few decades. Now the poor and working class are being forced to move to the suburbs and find places where they can get a place to live as the inner city becomes more gentrified and expensive. And now they've got commutes and so on. It's a complicated issue.
Yes. So people have to live somewhere.
That's right.
And so people of modest means oftentimes are now pushed out to the periphery of metropolitan areas where they have these very onerous commutes, and it puts more greenhouse gases in the air if they're driving, or if they're taking buses. It's a huge burden on them and their families, less time with their kids, and higher rates of divorce. There's all sorts of statistics associated with the longer commutes that people have. In Minneapolis, the labor unions got involved in housing reform because they said their employees at the hospitals downtown would have to take, 2 buses, and if they missed that, that exchange between the two, they'd be late for work, and then could get fired. And so it's really a bad situation where the government is interfering with what the market would do. The market, this is one of those rare cases.
Yeah.
I think where Ronald Reagan was right. The government is the problem, as the New York Times said in this, with respect to zoning. The government is creating this problem.
Yeah, what's interesting though is when most people say the government, I have a feeling they think of some big restrictive. It seems to me this is the government expressing the will of the people who live in those restrictive zoning communities.
Well, yes and no.
Good.
Zoning laws, which determine basically who gets to live where in America, make us more segregated and make housing less affordable. So exclusionary zoning laws are those which say that a community will only allow certain types of housing, like a detached single-family home, sometimes on a minimum lot size of a quarter acre or half an acre or even an acre. And so this excludes people of modest means from living in neighborhoods that have lots of resources, that have strong schools and safe neighborhoods. And it also means that there's just less housing in a metropolitan region. It artificially caps the supply of housing because on a certain plot of land, a builder might want to build several units that would be more affordable and increase the abundance of housing in a region, thus moderating prices. But the local government laws oftentimes make that illegal. They forbid the market from working.
And you point out that these laws began to appear more when racial laws began to disappear.
Absolutely. So in the early 20th century, a lot of communities throughout the country had explicit racial zoning laws. So they would say in Baltimore or Louisville or other communities, if you're black, you cannot buy in certain neighborhoods because you're zoned out, like it's illegal for you to buy. The Supreme Court in 1917 said that goes too far. It's a violation of the U.S. Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. Quickly, communities figured out that they could achieve much the same results through economic zoning. So these bans on multifamily housing and other mechanisms to exclude people of modest means, most of whom, or many of whom, were black and Hispanic. And so that was the first big uptick in economic zoning. The second big uptick came in the early 1970s after Congress passed the Fair Housing Act to make it illegal to discriminate based on race in housing. Communities, again, sought a economic workaround and doubled down on exclusionary zoning, really tightened up what builders could build in a community. And that effectively excluded a lot of black people and also swept up working class whites who also lose out under this regime of economic zoning.
Okay, so what that does is it without using the word race or even the word income or wealth, basically is restrictive and keeps us separate. What is the effect on schools and the effect? There's that wonderful study you point to in which Charlotte, I believe, looked at disadvantaged schools and with some of them gave them extra funding, but with others moved some of the kids from the underperforming schools into schools where they would be in wealthier neighborhoods, and yes, the results were pretty amazing.
Yes. So I did work with Charlotte Public Schools on some efforts to integrate, but the study was actually in Montgomery County, Maryland.
Oh, okay.
So right outside of Washington, D.C. And Montgomery County is a diverse community, so there are poor sections and wealthier sections of Montgomery County. And the school board, to their credit, said we're going to spend $2,000 extra per pupil in the higher poverty schools where there are more low-income students. At the same time, the Housing Authority had this wonderful program called inclusionary zoning, which is the opposite of exclusionary zoning. And when a builder develops a certain number of units, he or she has to set aside a proportion of those units for low-income and working-class families. And so some low-income families get to live in quite affluent neighborhoods in Montgomery County. And so the question is, where would a low-income student do better? With the extra $2,000 per pupil expenditure or in a more affluent area? And a researcher from the Rand Corporation studied these two interventions and found that the housing intervention mattered a lot more to education, that the low-income students in middle-class and upper-middle-class neighborhoods performed far better over time than those who got the extra $2,000 in funding. And the math gap with middle class kids was cut in half. The reading gap was cut by 1/3. So it's really one of the most important things we can do for low income students is give them a chance to live in higher opportunity, more affluent neighborhoods, and then attend the local public schools.
And what is the analysis of why that is so?
Well, the study itself did not delve into why, but there are lots of reasons that researchers have suggested that it matters whether your classmates are rich or poor. One has to do with peer effects. So if you're a low-income student surrounded by middle-class students who really just expect to go on to college, it's not even a question. It's not a question of if, but where they're going to go to college. Mm-hmm. That has a positive impact on the academic environment in those schools. And so low-income students benefit from that. In addition, teachers often consider it a promotion to move from a high-poverty school to a middle-class school because students have been given more advantages in life. There are fewer discipline issues for the most part, and so the job of teaching is easier. And so the most experienced, strongest teachers end up in avoiding most high poverty schools. So that's another reason that the low income students getting a chance to go to a middle class school benefit.
I would think even the notion of guidance counselors who might suggest college, that I'm just guessing that, of course, the school with more resources not only has that expectation for its students, but has the ability to hire people to pass that information on.
Absolutely. That's a big part of it. And then the last piece is, a school works better when parents are actively involved in volunteering in the classroom, kind of keeping an eye on things, certainly making financial donations to the school. And that just happens a lot more often in more affluent communities than in high poverty schools where, understandably, the parents, they might be working 3 jobs. They don't have a car to get to the PTA meeting. So for all those reasons, separate schools for rich and poor are inherently unequal. And we ought to find ways to try to loosen up the housing discrimination, economic housing discrimination that keeps us from making sure that the schools are more economically integrated.
Right. So separate but unequal shows up again, as it did in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education when it was about race. But it turns out that separate but unequal shows up again when it's income and wealth.
That's right. It's and increasingly so. For example, that issue of parental involvement in the schools, where it's a benefit to be in a school where lots of parents are active, that tracks much more by class than by race. That is to say, upper middle class Black parents also volunteer in class. Sure, it's really comes down to the economic segregation that's quite damaging. To be clear, I'm for racial integration for its own sake. I mean, I think it's a benefit to everyone when we come to know people of different races as colleagues and as peers. But in terms of raising academic achievement, it's really the concentrations of poverty that are the central driver of inequality, as opposed to race per se.
Very good. One of the things that you point out that I know gets a lot of attention, and so I'd like you to flesh it out a little bit so it's not just a headline, is that the most restrictive zoning is found in politically liberal cities where racial views are more progressive, but income discrimination is more prevalent. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, this was one of the most troubling findings that I came across in the research, and it's pretty consistent across studies that the worst forms of exclusionary zoning are in liberal areas. And I think it points to a larger problem in our society. So Fareed Zakaria has written quite aptly, I think, that the primary sin of the right is racism, and the cardinal sin of the left is elitism. And there's social science to back this up. So it turns out that when there's experimental research done, it shows that people with higher levels of education, on average, have less racial prejudice, which is a good thing and something we hope for. That
you're right.
The more open-minded, the more tolerant of people of all different backgrounds, all different races. The downside, though, is that the people with more education actually are more biased against those with less education. And so the philosopher Michael Sandel at Harvard has talked about the ways in which meritocracy, which is generally a good system for allocating opportunity, has a downside, which is that, as he says, people who are successful in the meritocracy, those with high levels of education, inhale a little too deeply of their success and look down on those who had less success educationally. And some of this research finds that people with higher levels of education can actively dislike those with less education, which brings us back to Hillary Clinton's
exactly. That my mind went the same place for sure.
Yes. So that's something that as liberals, I think we have to grapple with and face head on, because that's not what liberalism or the Democratic Party traditionally stood for. It stood for average Americans and improving their lot. And now there's this increasing elitism problem, and it's manifested very, very clearly in the housing arena. Just to give you one quick example,
sure.
Scarsdale, New York, gave about 75% of its votes for Joe Biden, and I'm personally glad they did. But they also have terrible exclusion in their zoning policies, where there's a virtual ban on any kind of multifamily housing, and they keep people of modest means out of their community.
And I'm reading from something I picked up in researching for this. Class discrimination, what we're talking about here, helps explain why, despite a 25% decline in black-white residential segregation since 1970, which is significant, income segregation has more than doubled.
Yes. Now that's the trend we're seeing in our society. And if you think about racial attitudes, I mean, obviously we've got a long way to go, but compared to decades ago, we're far, far ahead of where we were. Meanwhile, economic inequality has increased, and with it, wealthy people are increasingly living in their separate enclaves, and that create a self-perpetuating system where their kids have the best schools and the most opportunity, and then it's replicated in the next generation. So this is the political scientist Robert Putnam says, we're seeing creeping economic apartheid in this country.
Yeah, one of the last permissible prejudices in a way, because you can pretend it's not. California, I think, more than most sections of the country, though it is a problem throughout our country, I believe, for the most part, has a housing crisis. And everything we're talking about here contributes to that housing crisis. And let me just read what State Senator Scott Wiener, who's been trying to legalize multifamily living spaces, he told you that Republican and Democratic legislators representing working class communities support reform, while the opponents have one thing in common: they represent wealthier constituents who want to keep certain people out of their community.
Yes, that's right. Which brings us back to where we started with Bobby Kennedy.
Yep.
Because the exciting thing in California is that there was a bipartisan, class-based coalition of working class Black and Hispanic communities allied with working class white communities. Some represented by Republicans, others represented by Democrats, who came together and essentially defeated the opposition of wealthy white suburbs to housing reform. And so they've now legalized up to 4 units on what had been a single-family lot throughout the state. And they've legalized a lot of, more apartments near transit. They've also had a lot of progress with something called accessory dwelling units. These are the backyard, small backyard homes. This is very. I'm in Long Beach, California. This is very much on the minds of people here. DUI, those extra units where people can make a little extra income, but they also are providing housing in affordable housing in places where it might not have been. Finally, let's bring it to a close, Richard, by talking about what the Biden administration proposes to do about this, because I think this gives us at least a sense, as we've just said, California, perhaps the most progressive state in the country, has bucked that stereotype that they're the ones that are toughest on this issue by the state law you just mentioned. And now what the Biden administration is attempting to do about these issues. Well, this is the issue of exclusionary zoning is tailor-made for Joe Biden. He's someone who stood for concern for working people of all races. He's been a strong proponent of civil rights, strong proponent of the environment, as you point out, and someone who wants to unify the country. And so he has proposed a number of steps to reduce exclusionary barriers. Mostly he's emphasized so-called carrots rather than sticks. That is, he wants to provide and has provided some federal funding as an incentive for communities to reform and reduce their exclusionary zoning laws so they are more open to additional housing and more types of housing. And so he's taken that positive step. I'm hoping he goes even further. I've been working with Congressman Emanuel Cleaver in the House on the idea of an economic fair housing act where you could actually sue exclusive communities and say you're engaging in income discrimination, and unless you can provide some powerful justification for your laws, then those exclusionary practices need to end. So I think Biden has done a lot of really important things, and there are lots more opportunities for him and others to get involved in this issue.
Very good. Let me just say to listeners, I hope that this conversation has enlightened you and maybe brought something just into view, something that is under the surface but into view, in which case you can look at what's happening at your very local level, the larger county level, the state level, and the national level to begin to change this, because as Richard KAHLENBERG points out, it is bad for us, and the alternative of inclusive, integrated income, just as we work to integrate race, the work has just a range of benefits. It's good for community, it's good for unity, it's good for healing the country, it's good for climate, it's good for pollution, it's good for education, and anything, I would say, that brings more people into opportunity and into possibility, that is that is the most important thing in a way we can do to keep this country moving forward. Again, the book is Excluded, How Snob Zoning, NIMBYism, and Class Bias Build the Walls We Don't See. And Richard's website is richardkahlenberg.org. That's Richard and then Kahlenberg, KAHLENBERG, Richard Kahlenberg, all one word, .org. For this conversation and many other interviews and articles, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to TerenceMcNally.net, TerenceMcNally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. That's the same website. If you want to get a weekly announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and usually links to 10 or 12 articles, you can email me at TEMcNally, TEMCNALLY @mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the podcast on Apple Podcasts and at most of those podcast sites. You'll find years of podcasts at my site and at those sites. Michael Lewis, Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Greg Boyle, George Packer, etc. You can follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to Kiana Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all, you, my listeners. Please share this podcast widely. And finally, thank you, Richard Kahlenberg, and keep up your good work.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Terence.